at about 5:30 in the evening, two park policemen respond to a 911 call reporting an accident on the Colonial Parkway. They are flagged down by an individual. They follow him a short distance to an embankment above the York River, which flows through the park. They see a 1980 white Honda sedan, nose first in the river. They immediately work their way down to see if there's someone trapped in this car. They find two women in the car with a ghost-like appearance, and their throats have been deeply slashed. This is not an accident. It's a homicide.
What you see in front of you is the actual Colonial Parkway.
My name is Danny Plott. During the Colonial Parkway murder investigations, I was a special agent with the Virginia State Police. Back when the 1986 murder occurred, the Colonial Parkway was similar, but it wasn't as well maintained. It's a beautiful scenic drive. But in the late 80s, when these murders occurred, it was a pretty dark and spooky place.
Plott is an old-time cop. Danny has suffered the slings and arrows, like me, of the press and the public and the two-bit politicians and so on and so on. So it was a natural thing that he and I became friends. Hey, man.
Joe?
How are you?
Good. Yourself?
The same. Still walking around.
Me and you both.
Danny first called me because he liked my show.
I watched an episode of Homicide Hunter, and Joe's show was wonderful. You know, he would say something, and then there'd be the my. I was impressed.
And he let me know that and asked me what it was like to live in Colorado Springs, and I informed him I had moved.
And he said, I live in Suffolk, Virginia. No shit.
He asked if we could meet for lunch. I said yes.
Talking with Joe is an experience in itself. His ability with murders is amazing to me. I talked to him for hours about the Colonial Parkway murders.
Which I had vaguely heard about 2,200 miles away in Colorado. They meant nothing to me at the time because they were outside my jurisdiction. But now they interested me. Danny Plott mentioned that there's been an enormous amount of press coverage. There's been a book written about him, all kinds of things. And I did not disagree with his thought process on the entire case. He was certainly on the right track. For 37 years, the killer was unknown. And the Colonial Parkway murders was his torturous career case.
Solving the case became an infatuation. It became frustrating. Sometimes we felt like we were really close in finding who did these murders. And then something would knock them out of it. Every stone that you could think of was overturned, yet here we were. Nobody was in handcuffs. The Colonial Parkway is a rural, scenic road that connects three of the biggest historical places in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Yorktown all the way to Jamestown and the Williamsburg area.
And because it's a federal park, there are no structures, no businesses, no billboards, no marks of the 21st century. There are trees and bushes and vines. So if you're on this stretch at night, You're in a Stephen King novel for 23 miles.
The Parkway also has multiple overlooks. You can call it a lover's lane. If you wanted privacy, it was the perfect place. The murders started in October of 1986. The park rangers were aghast at what they saw.
The park police summoned the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the only jurisdiction within that park, because it is federal property.
The two girls, they were identified immediately because their identifications were in the car. Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski. Their throats have been cut very badly. This was something brutal. What was very puzzling to the FBI, that blood was not in the car.
The amount of blood would have been substantial, and we've never found any bloody prints, any bloody clothing. Clearly, inside of that car is not the crime scene. Somewhere else they were killed and put into that car. Was it driven there? I don't know.
They examine the ground in this pull-off area, assuming they will find a second set of tire tracks. They find tire tracks that match the tires on the Honda, but they find no tire tracks of another vehicle.
What was really perplexing was the car was covered in diesel fuel. And there were matches around where it appeared that someone had tried to get the diesel fuel to light.
Diesel has a very high ignition point. You could light an entire book of matches and throw it into liquid diesel fuel, and all that would happen is the diesel fuel would put out the fire.
It was a failed attempt at trying to cover up their crime.
Now, what does that tell you? Whoever this is has diesel fuel. There's a lot of people that carry diesel fuel around in their vehicle. Truckers do, people that have a diesel car, or people with boats. Interesting.
This was not an easy case to solve. Why would somebody target two women? There's no money taken, and they're viciously, I mean viciously attacked.
Whoever is responsible for this crime is an organized offender. He has a plan. He somehow gets control of these people, and then he attacks and kills both and sends the car over the side of this embankment. You and I both know it's not difficult to push a car. You kick it out of gear, and one person can easily move a car.
Sure. But remember that it's sitting in an overlook. It's a paved overlook. Then you have a patch of grass, and there's a curb. Not a high curb, but there's a curb. So someone or some people were strong enough to push it, pop it over that. But with two passengers in it, always felt like it was somebody with some strength.
Likely a man. Could have a helper. So now you have a solid view of what this crime scene looks like, but you're not even really sure how it happened. You need an autopsy to tell you more. So the FBI agents head to the Virginia State Medical Examiner's office. The autopsy results show that the girls had been dead for a minimum of 24 hours.
Rebecca's throat was cut, and it was cut viciously. But Kathleen was almost decapitated. There's a brutality in that. I think that says that somebody was really angry for whatever reason.
There was no evidence of sexual assault on either victim, but they found something else. The autopsy revealed that both girls suffered ligature strangulation. A ligature is any device used to put pressure on the neck to restrict the windpipe to die from asphyxia.
And in Kathleen's hair, there was a small piece of rope.
The autopsy further decides that the throat slashing was accomplished post-mortem and had nothing to do with their death. They were dead when their throats were cut. They were essentially killed twice. Who the hell are we dealing with here?
Rebecca and Kathleen were last seen Thursday night. A Honda Civic was found off the Colonial Parkway. It had been rolled into these bushes, almost into the water. The women were found with their throats slit.
The FBI agents go and notify the two victims' families of their untimely demise and say, "Tell me about your daughter."
My name's Bill Thomas. I'm the older brother of Kathy Thomas. She was fun and smart and a great friend, and her attitude was just so positive that people were drawn to her.
She graduated in the second class from the U.S. Naval Academy that had women.
She ended up first serving on this ship, a submarine tender called the USS L.Y. Spear. Now, it's during this time, though, she's also investigated for being a lesbian.
In the 1980s, the Navy remained archaic with draconian rules. Homosexuality was not acceptable in any form, particularly so in a female.
This was not going to be a place that she could live her life as a lesbian in an open fashion.
And she resigned her commission.
Even though she had left the Navy with great reluctance, Kathy was actually turning a corner into a really happy, less pressured version of her life. She was dating this wonderful woman, Rebecca Dowski.
Rebecca Dowski came from Poughkeepsie, New York. She originally attended Dickinson College and had transferred to the College of William and Mary in Virginia. She was a very bright student, and she really fit in well there.
She was in her senior year, sweet, smart, extremely athletic. She was on a championship women's softball team. So both Kathy and Becky had this I can accomplish anything attitude.
Kathy and her girlfriend were not accepted by society at large. Privacy was very important to them. What better place than the Colonial Parkway at night?
The FBI investigators focused on Kathy being in a lesbian relationship with Becky. Now, what really makes that come into play is she had been dating someone else.
There were all of these rumors that one of Rebecca's ex-lovers had gotten angry and, retaliated against the both of them.
He was Muslim. The Muslim religion does not always look at gay or lesbian relationships kindly.
Ex-boyfriend Sharif Ali realizes that Becky has left him for another woman. He is furious. He has very strong feelings about homosexual behavior, and now he's been passed over for a member of the same sex by his girlfriend. It makes him an astounding suspect. So they bring Ali Sharif in for questioning. And he admits that he has been embarrassed by her departure for another female, but he would never do her harm. He also has an alibi. He was in Washington, D.C. for the weekend, 200 miles away during the time of the killings. He may have had a motive, but he physically couldn't have done it. Over the next few weeks, the investigation slows, but the notoriety of the case really starts to move.
The two friends were last seen together in Dowski's dorm room at 7 p.m. Police sources think Dowski and Thomas then drove here to the Colonial Parkway.
I remember the ratings were extremely high. People were watching. They were talking about the romantic relationship between the two. One of the motives for a killer is someone that is opposed to this type of lifestyle.
Friends say driving along the Colonial Parkway was a Thursday night routine for Dowski and Thomas. But what happened October 9th wasn't routine. It was murder.
I don't think we understood the full gravity of what happened out there in October of '86 until September of '87. Then I think it took on a different life of its own.
Olive White Sheriff's deputy is out patrolling the Ragged Island Wildlife Management Area. There is a black pickup truck. The door is open, and no one is around.
Something was going on. The truck was running, the radio was on, and there were shoes and articles of clothing in the truck.
He calls for assistance. They go through the truck and they notice a wallet on top of the dashboard that contains a driver's license.
It was a gentleman named David Noblin. David Noblin was 19 years old. He was a resident of Newport News.
His mother has already reported him missing because he didn't return home after an evening out.
The last time he was seen was in the company of a young lady named Robin Edwards. Robin was also a Newport News resident, and she was 14 years old and was also missing.
Now everyone is alarmed. So where are the occupants of this vehicle, and what has happened to them?
Ragged Island is a creepy place to go. It's very secluded.
This parking lot was used as a lover's lane type area. It sounds a lot like the Colonial Parkway.
They had a feeling this wasn't going to end well, and they were right.
Year-old David Noblin and 14-year-old Robin Edwards were last seen Saturday night. His truck was found with the keys in the ignition, door open, and radio on near the James River Bridge.
The Olive White Sheriff's Department launches a massive search. It's very difficult to search. There are vines and weeds and brush of all sorts. They could be almost anywhere.
Personnel from multiple agencies, a helicopter, search dogs.
This search goes on for days.
And unfortunately, on the third day, they found something.
My dad was out there at Ragged Island, chest waders, walking that whole area, looking for him.
Carl Noblin, God bless him. There were people that were telling Carl Noblin not to go down the beach. He said, you aren't going to stop me. I'm going down there.
David Noblin's father, Carl Noblin, found the bodies. I can only imagine what that's like, because they were not in very good shape.
Oh, he was brokenhearted, and we were out there with him. It was so devastating. Carl Noblin was a broken man.
Yeah, my dad didn't even have a chance to call us and give us a heads up. My mom and I, we found out on the news. I remember hearing my mom scream. My God. It was horrible.
The bodies were found further down on the riverbank itself. The James River there is brackish or brine. It's not fresh water, it's not salt water. It's a combination. And that did not do good things to human bodies.
Both bodies are bloated from decomposition, having been out for 3 or 4 days.
Robin Edwards had one gunshot wound, execution style, to the back of her head. David had 2 gunshot wounds. A gunshot wound to the left shoulder and 1 shot to the back of the head. I think Robin was shot first. And I think David knew he had 1 chance. We speculate he tried to climb a sandy clay bank, and he was within almost grabbing distance of a tree line. That's where he was shot once in the shoulder. That incapacitated enough to where he was then shot in the back of the head and killed.
I totally disagree with that. He would definitely not run from a fight. Even if the guy had a gun, he wouldn't run from it.
So why are these bodies such a long walk from where the truck was located? Why would they go such a far distance from this vehicle?
When you leave that parking lot and you want to go down here, you have to walk down this boardwalk because all this is marshland, like swamp. Mm-hmm. So to get down to here, good little walk. But you don't walk down a wooden, older boardwalk barefoot.
Not willingly.
No, not willingly. So how did they end up down there?
2 possibilities, in my opinion. They're running from somebody, barefoot because they don't have time to put their shoes on, or they're marched down there by the perpetrator. So who would want to murder these 2 people in cold blood? Investigators go to the families to see if they can determine suspects.
This is the way I seen my brother, like this one. Just him laid back, cutting up, having fun, smiling, you know? I definitely looked up to David. He tried toughening me up, and he did it with kicking my butt a lot. He was a great brother. I met Robin through my cousin Jason. We went to the same school together. She was always a real cool person.
We had sort of prepared ourselves for them to find her either hurt, possibly drowned. We were not prepared to find her murdered.
Robin was the youngest of the Colonial Parkway murder victims. She was 14. She had been through a lot in life. She was the kind of girl that often ran away. She got into trouble.
She could be very, very sweet, and she could be the most aggravating and irritating child in the world. She was very independent.
But Robin was also at a turning point in her life. She was finally starting to apply herself to her classes. She was starting to turn things around.
The big questions unanswered are, why was David with Robin at the wildlife preserve? And what happened after they got there?
That day, I followed him out, bummed a cigarette from him, and we talked in the driveway for 15, 20 minutes, I guess, and then he left. I carried that through my life, that I was able to say bye to him. I don't know why. It just seems so small now, but at the time it was big.
So they learned that David and Robin were hanging out at an arcade in the area with their friends. and David agreed to take Robin home. They are not a couple, according to the family, but what does the killer see? A man and a woman. And what would he assume from that? They are lovers, in Lover's Lane, as were the first two women. Much of this is very familiar.
The murders are the ultimate mystery. Where were they killed? By whom? And with what motive? Were they killed deliberately or by chance? Questions which, as of now, have no answers.
That drove those of us that worked on the task force that we need to find this person because they're just heartless and brutal. When David and Robin were autopsied, the investigation revealed that Robin had been sodomized and there was still semen in her cavity. The medical examiner said this sample is very degraded because you had bodies laying in the water for 3 days.
This is 1987. DNA is in its infancy.
DNA databases were either non-existent or just starting, but the sample was preserved.
So now what? There's a possibility the motive is sexual assault of the female victim, but it's only a possibility. But why kill them? There's no answer for that. Despite the differences, the similarities are just too great. Proximity, darkness, area, type. People don't get killed in parked cars very often. The odds are great. This is the same person or persons responsible for both. You've got a hunter, somebody who's busy. A year later, the appetite returns.
They haven't been arrested. They probably haven't even been talked to.
No, they haven't been found. So now they become convinced that maybe they're pretty clever. Let me do this again, because God, it was good the first time.
But I'm not going to do it where I did it before.
No, but still in the general vicinity. They kill where it's convenient.
Places they know.
And I would be very worried that the bodies were going to start to pile up here. 4 dead, and there's going to be more dead if that theory is correct. He's going to do it again. He will continue unless he is stopped. These murders came to be known as the Colonial Parkway murders.
Police sources claim that 2 cases are so alike, the same persons may be responsible.
This story really picked up from the very beginning. It was very much an East Coast highlighted story because double murders were incredibly rare.
These young couples are violently dead in an otherwise picturesque place. How could this be?
Everyone was talking about whether this is the work of a serial killer.
Once the police realized, oh my God, we're dealing with connected crimes or potentially connected crimes, police presence on the Parkway increased dramatically.
And that was the first time we heard about the possibility of a serial killer or a pattern emerging. And I felt the investigation begin to shift.
It turned this area upside down. I mean, people were scared to go up and down the parkways, and my mom was scared to death when I went out. Scared to death.
Everyone is very busy now looking for people who seem to be out of the area, seem to be doing something that doesn't look right.
After the murders, people realized they may be going to the Colonial Parkway at their own risk, but it didn't stop them. Sure, the last thing they thought of is that they would get approached or grabbed on the Colonial Parkway. It scared a lot of people, but unfortunately it didn't scare them all.
The families held a vigil, a memorial to remind us all the killer is still out there.
The pressure exerted by the press and by the public results in the formation of a Colonial Parkway Murders Task Force, where agencies come together. More heads are better than one. Danny Plott was a trained and experienced homicide agent, plot became in command.
We were given a conference room and told to have at it.
The common theory at the time is that the perpetrator is driving around the Colonial Parkway area looking for victims parked in a car alone in the dark in a lover's lane kind of area.
One thing we tried, we took a male agent and a female agent, and we put them in cars, different nights, different times, and waited to be approached. I worked some surveillance. I had a beard. I had actual hair. I was lucky enough to know who I was with, but you run out of things to talk about after a couple hours. Surveillance is cool in the movies. It is far from it in real life. We were approached. But all we did was, I think, scare the living daylights out of somebody that just was hoping they could see naked flesh. Somebody that just kind of hung around and tried to look in. Nobody wished any more for an arrest than those of us that were on that task force.
Your killer is a shadow in the night. You're pedaling a bike that is stationary, and no matter how hard you pedal, it goes nowhere.
The task force established tip lines.
And you get hit with tons of tips that are just crazy.
Many people will call in and report that little green men from Mars are responsible for this. But every once in a while, somebody says something that sounds reasonable, and you pay attention to that.
There was a man named Sammy Ryder that said he saw Robin and David. Maybe here's a lead we can work with.
Sam Reeder was at Ragged Island and remembers seeing David's truck.
I just took one quick look around. I flashed my headlights back in the brush, but I couldn't see anything.
He paints himself as an eyewitness. They bring Sammy Reeder in, they talk to him. So Mr. Reeder says that he stops at Ragged Island on his way home from a date. He notices this truck.
He said that he saw Robin and David get out of the car.
He admires the truck, said it's very nice, very clean.
The truck was running, the radio was on.
So he says all these things, none of which is earth-shattering because it's what the press reported.
Another statement was, I heard 2 shots. They had to be coming from the marshland way in the back. I decided it was time to leave, and I left. There are several things wrong with Ryder's statement.
There were actually 3 shots fired that night. 2 were fired at David Knobling and 1 at Robin.
Sammy didn't mention anything about them being barefoot, but their shoes are in the car.
The sand down there is not smooth sand. It is made up with a lot of jagged shells, etc.
It is extremely unlikely, not wearing shoes or socks, that they would walk this far in rough terrain on their own accord.
Somebody marched them down to the place where they died. They did not get out of the car and go strolling down there.
He is inserting himself in a serial killer investigation. Now, why would he do that?
When Mr. Ryder was pressed, he finally admitted, well, I took money out of David Knobling's wallet. I don't know if he figured if he came up with this tip and they found his print somewhere on the truck, he would be able to say, well, I was just looking in. Well, I think he did it out of trying to cover his ass.
What he saw was a wallet, and he took advantage of it. Oh, Sammy, why are you wasting our time with this? He didn't kill two people. He didn't know who did.
Law enforcement were very frustrated with the investigation. They weren't solving the case. People were fearful.
I've noticed that a lot of girls aren't walking on campus by themselves, especially late at night.
Obviously, we have to consider that there's a dangerous person or persons still in the community.
We needed this task force to try to, if not tie these murders together, find common denominators or separate them.
Plott is experienced and he's smart. He sees the rivers. And he said, hey, look at this map. What is around all of these crime scenes? Water. How do you move in water? You move in water in a boat.
The thing I remember about the autopsies of Kathleen and Rebecca was this rope that was found. It was a piece of nautical rope, which to me, nautical rope is either used on a boat or used to tie up a boat.
Now that is an interesting fact. What if our man is a boater? Maybe we've been thinking about this wrong the entire time. How did he approach these people?
If he used the boat in some way, I think he had to anchor the boat on the river and use a smaller boat to come to the bank.
If you got a trolling motor, it makes little or no sound. So you can maneuver around in this water and nobody even knows you're there. You have no obligation legally to put lights on your boat. You're not at sea. You're in inland waterways. No one's going to question you. You're a waterman.
Right.
The word waterman is very specific to this area. It's people who are involved in the oyster business and the fishing business in the York River, the James River, and the Rappahannock River. They have their own dialect. They have their own language generationally, all the way back to the colonial period.
This could be a waterman. That's someone we need to concentrate on.
So what else do we know? The toys used in these crimes are the toys that watermen use as tools. Most of these boats have diesel motors.
Diesel was used in Rebecca and Kathleen's murder. Whoever killed them brought diesel fuel with them to the scene.
We have an extremely sharp instrument that cuts their throats. Fishermen take care of their knives.
Part of their living.
Part of their living, sharp as a razor. You can fillet a fish in a heartbeat. This all became known as the waterman theory. Danny Plott and other cops he brought with him survey the fishermen in the area. These are an unusual lot. They operate in private, they're loners.
They are tough as oak. They did not take kindly to being, even interviewed.
They picked a lifestyle that they don't want to interact with people. And for straight-laced FBI guys to walk into a waterman bar and say, hey, we want to ask some questions, they're not going to get any progress from that.
At this point, it's an all-hands-on-deck sort of investigation. But as it turns out, shortly they will discover even that is not enough. The park police have informed Danny Plott they have found yet another abandoned vehicle on the Colonial Parkway. The keys are in the ignition, the car is running, and nobody's around, and Plott's heart is in his throat.
You're going, oh shit, here we go again.
The Colonial Parkway serial killer is back in business. Danny Plott is very concerned. Where are the people from this car?
This has a lot of similarities to the other murders.
Lovers lanes, near water, only 1 mile from the Thomas Dowski crime scene. 1 mile? Are you kidding me?
The park rangers informed Plott that they ran a registration check on the vehicle and determined it's owned by Keith Call. They contact Call's parents. They report him missing that morning. The parents say he was with a female named Cassandra Haley. And Cassandra Haley's parents also report her missing. Where are they?
Some of their clothes and the car keys found inside the car.
A Navy security team looks through the woods. Park rangers use a bloodhound and a boat for air scent over the water. Other dogs comb the beachfront area.
A dog traced the couple's scent to the water's edge.
And then the scent ends.
The dogs are telling them those bodies are in this water. But they're not there now because water moves and it moves bodies with it.
I searched the Parkway in a company of United States Marines who walked an arm's length away from each other across a whole area near where that car was found.
The search dogs take the scent and they march directly to the York River.
And that night, the nor'easter had been passing through.
Right. High waves,
high current,
60, 70 mile an hour winds, and driving rain. So they are disposed of, killed by some method or means. They go in the York River, the nor'easter comes and sweeps them where? Out to sea. Maybe all the way out.
Wouldn't take much.
And these two poor, unfortunate young people are never found.
Not a trace of them. The families couldn't even have a funeral.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound.
I didn't want to think the worst to start with. All of a sudden, there's all these police calling the house, and then as the day went on, you just kind of came into that reality that something had happened. Keith just vanished into thin air.
Keith was really just a good-hearted kid. And you just don't ever think that when somebody walks out of the door, it's going to be the last time you see him.
He was into computers, We had some of the first. He was in there banging away on his Commodore 64 and learning everything about that. And he was just like that 80s guy.
In 1988, when this happened, he was in his first semester of college. And then with Cassandra, they were friends. And she was really a pretty girl.
Cassandra was the it girl. She was a cheerleader. She's got a magnetism about her. She was very bright. She was really looking forward to completing her education and going on with a career.
They went out that night to a movie, and then they decided to stop by some kind of college party going on there.
Friends confirm Keith and Sandra partied at the University Square Apartments April 10th. They left around 2 a.m., then disappeared.
And then Cassandra had to be home at a certain time. They said their goodbyes, and that's the last time anybody saw them.
The Parkway was not a place that you went like that and just left your car there. Keith was more responsible than that. The other murders had already happened. Keith wouldn't have went there.
It always haunted me, and it haunts me to this day, that we did not find Keith and Cassandra's remains. We have to find the murdering son bitch that did this.
They finally decide, all right, let's go back and start over.
About 6 months into the FBI task force of the Colonial Parkway murders, We had come to a couple conclusions. Looking at all the scenes, the vehicles, the wallets out, we decided who we were looking for was a person of authority.
So imagine now it's nighttime here. You're with somebody you care about. You're not really thinking about anything. And then suddenly, there's a knock on your window, and a man with a flashlight says, "What are you doing here? You're not supposed to be here."
What if this killer poses as a policeman? In the process of somebody getting out their ID, he pulls a gun, so he now has control. Could that be? Of course it could.
During this era, you could buy an old cop car complete with a side light, etc., for $300 at a police auction and duplicate being a cop.
We decided to hold a press conference with the FBI's blessing, and it exploded.
It reached the point where even in the newspaper articles, they were warning people to verify that if they were being pulled over, that it was really a policeman.
The media took it and ran with it because it made a good story.
Nothing about this seems to work, and then you begin to convince yourself that nothing will ever work. Law enforcement are running out of room at the morgue. This is one serious guy. He's not gonna stop. As cases go on for years, they become more difficult. Colonial Parkway murders have slowed down. Nothing much has been happening. No news, no new events. An anonymous tipster calls the task force and says an individual has been harassing couples in the Lover's Lane pull-offs on the Colonial Parkway.
They called him a peeping Tom.
Really? Now that is interesting. Who might you be, Mr. Peeping Tom? And what are you doing on the Parkway?
Through a FBI or state police tip line, we get a tip that a man in a blue truck is stopping and looking in parked cars on the Parkway. They get a tag. The tag reads EMRAW. Eat 'em raw. What do you eat raw? Oysters. That truck comes back to a waterman named Alan Wilmer. So now the FBI has somebody that they can look at.
This could be him. This could be the Colonial Parkway killer, and they need to act fast.
The FBI and the Virginia State Police now have what appears to be a viable suspect. The FBI surveils him, goes to his residence, where they find him cleaning his truck.
They noticed Wilmer was out spray painting the back of his vehicle, and that he was bleaching the interior of the vehicle.
Now, why would he do that? Is he concealing evidence?
Maybe this is our guy. They immediately go to get a search warrant.
The FBI return to Wilmer's place. They present him with the warrant. He is cooperative. He steps aside and they search the premise.
They do the search warrant of his truck. Doesn't reveal a whole lot, but the search of his house reveals several things.
They find an enormous supply of pornography. They find guns. They find pairs of handcuffs and other bondage devices.
I am not saying that makes you someone that kills people, but you put everything together. This is not your average guy.
They continue to talk to him. He denies any knowledge of any of this, denies everything. They have no evidence that could result in an arrest. They decide that they will have an FBI polygraphist take a shot at this guy.
Mr. Wilmer was interviewed, and he did admit to being on the Parkway and approaching a vehicle or two.
Which was very useful information, but his story changed a little bit.
He said, yeah, I was on a Colonial Parkway, but I wasn't in that particular pull-off. I was in another one. I walk around out there and I look for places to fish. Nothing wrong with that, and there isn't anything wrong with that. So he takes the polygraph. And the polygraphist says he didn't do this. He's innocent. And the FBI looks at that polygraphist and says, well, you better be right.
The FBI decided that
it was a quiet evening in Perugia, a medieval Italian town whose stone streets usually echoed with the laughter of students and the soft hum of conversations from the local cafes. Perugia was known for its history, for its walls that seemed to guard not only the city, but also the secrets of centuries past. In 2007, the city was alive with international students, young men and women from across Europe and beyond, arriving to immerse themselves in Italian language and culture. Among them was Meredith Kircher, a 21-year-old exchange student from the United Kingdom. She had come to Italy to study, to learn, to live her youth in one of the most beautiful places in Europe. But instead of memories of joy and discovery, Meredith's name would soon become synonymous with one of the most infamous crimes of the century. November 1st, 2007. It was All Saints' Day in Italy, a national holiday. Streets were emptier than usual, shops closed, the atmosphere hushed. Perugia, usually bustling, seemed like a city under a soft, reverent silence. Meredith spent her day with friends, relaxed, unaware of what was to come. The crisp autumn air carried with it the faint scent of wood smoke and the cold bite of early November. Students, including Meredith, enjoyed the break from classes. She had dinner with friends that night. A simple meal, a night like so many others. Yet somewhere in the shadows, danger was already drawing near. Her flat, located on Via della Pergola, stood at the edge of town, slightly secluded, surrounded by trees and overlooked by neighboring houses. Inside that house, life was typical of young students abroad. Shared rooms, laughter, arguments over chores, plans for parties. Meredith shared the house with several other women, among them Amanda Knox, an American student whose life would soon be forever intertwined with hers. On that night, Meredith walked back to the house, climbing the old stone steps, key in hand, not knowing she was walking toward the final moments of her life. The details of what happened inside those walls have been disputed, twisted by testimony, misremembered in the chaos of investigation. But what is certain is this. Sometime that evening, Meredith was attacked in her room. The sound of a struggle may have echoed faintly through the walls, muffled by closed doors. Neighbors would later recall noises they dismissed as drunken students, the kind of background chaos common in a university town. But this was no harmless noise. It was the sound of a young woman fighting for her life. Meredith was stabbed multiple times, her body left in a pool of blood. She suffered, terrified, betrayed by the sudden cruelty of the world around her. By the time silence fell again in that little house on Via della Pergola, Meredith Kircher's voice, her laughter, her dreams were gone. Only horror remained, seeping into the floorboards, staining the walls, lingering like a shadow that would never be erased. The next day, November 2nd, the ordinary rhythms of life resumed in Perugia. The holiday was over. Streets filled again with footsteps, shops reopened, and students returned to their routines. But at Via della Pergola, something was wrong. Amanda Knox had stayed elsewhere the night before with her boyfriend, Raffaele Sollecito. When she returned that morning, she noticed small things that unsettled her. The door was ajar. Inside, the bathroom bore spots of blood. Tiny at first, easily explained away, perhaps. A drop on the sink, another on the faucet. But the unease grew with every step she took deeper into the house. The washing machine was running, filled with clothes. Strange. One roommate's door was locked, unusual for a holiday morning. Knox and Sollecito grew more concerned. They tried to contact Meredith. No answer. They knocked on her door. Silence. The door was locked. Something about that silence was heavy, suffocating. Eventually, police were called. At first, officers arrived expecting a burglary. The window of one room was smashed, glass scattered, but nothing seemed to be missing. Then the focus shifted to Meredith's locked door. Carabinieri officers forced it open. What they found on the other side would shock them to the core. Meredith lay on the floor, lifeless, her throat slashed, the room in disarray. Blood painted the floor, the walls, even the bedsheets. A nightmare scene, the kind that leaves an imprint on every witness. The smell of iron from the blood hung in the air. Officers froze, confronted with the reality that this was no accident, no break-in gone wrong. It was deliberate, savage. Word spread quickly. Within hours, the house was surrounded by police cars, journalists, neighbors whispering in disbelief. How could such a thing happen in their quiet town? Students gathered in shock, exchanging fragments of information, piecing together rumors. An English student had been murdered. A girl from Leeds, studying abroad, gone. The British Embassy was contacted. Meredith's parents would soon receive the call no parent should ever hear. As investigators began their work, they faced a crime scene that seemed both chaotic and strangely staged. Blood everywhere, yet certain elements didn't add up. The broken window appeared too clean, the glass scattered in a way that suggested it had been broken from the inside, not the outside. The burglary theory began to crumble almost immediately. This was something else, something darker. Attention turned toward those who lived in the house. Amanda Knox, barely 20, from Seattle, was questioned. Raffaele Sollecito, her Italian boyfriend, became part of the investigation. Both insisted they had spent the night together, far from the scene. Yet police noted inconsistencies, odd behavior. Knox's demeanor seemed strangely casual at times. Witnesses recalled her kissing Sollecito outside the house as investigators moved Meredith's body. To police, it looked like callousness, even arrogance. To others, perhaps it was shock, the numbing disorientation that makes people act in ways they themselves don't understand. Still, suspicion grows quickly in the vacuum of horror. The press began to circle, hungry for details. Angel-faced killer, some headlines would later call Knox. Meredith's story began to be overshadowed by the drama surrounding the suspects, but in that first night, in those first days, the focus was on the brutality of the crime itself. Who could do such a thing? Who had been in that house with Meredith as she screamed, as she fought, as she died? The autopsy revealed the brutality with chilling clarity. Multiple wounds, signs of a struggle, defensive injuries on Meredith's arms and hands. She had fought desperately to survive. But she had been overpowered, subdued, her life extinguished with cold precision. There was no mercy in the attack. The knife wounds were deep, deliberate. This was rage, or cruelty, or both. The investigators began to piece together a timeline. Meredith had returned home around 9 p.m. She had eaten dinner with friends earlier. By 10 p.m., she was likely already back in her room. Sometime after that, the killer entered. Whether it was one person or several, police were not yet certain. But Meredith's last hours were spent in terror, trapped in a locked room with her attacker. Forensic teams combed through the house, searching for evidence. Every fiber, every fingerprint, Every footprint mattered. And then came the discovery that would ignite one of the most controversial trials in modern history, a bloody footprint, partial DNA traces, evidence that seemed to point not only to Knox and Solicito, but also to another man, Rudy Guede, a local known to police for minor offenses. His DNA was found on Meredith's body, in her room, undeniable, irrefutable. Yet the presence of others was less clear, contested, debated for years to come. As night fell on Perugia once more, the town no longer felt safe. Parents locked their doors earlier. Students looked over their shoulders. Friends stayed closer together. A sense of violation settled over the city. Perugia had been known for art, for culture, for the gentle rhythm of Italian life. Now it was marked by blood, by fear, by the specter of evil that had entered one student's home and left behind only silence. And at the center of it all was Meredith Kircher, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her, now reduced to headlines, to crime scene photos, to evidence in plastic bags. Yet behind the tragedy, she was still someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend. Her absence was not just a mystery to be solved, but a wound that would never fully heal. The investigation was just beginning. Suspects would soon be questioned, alibis tested, friendships broken under pressure. But on that first night, as police sealed off Via della Pergola and journalists lit up the street with camera flashes, the truth was still hidden in the shadows. Meredith was gone, and the search for justice had only just begun. The morning after Meredith Kircher's body was discovered, the medieval calm of Perugia was shattered by the arrival of dozens of investigators, journalists, and forensic experts. The small stone house at Via della Pergola was transformed into a fortress of flashing cameras and uniformed police officers. Crime scene tape cordoned off the entrance, and neighbors watched from their windows, whispering about what they had heard, what they thought, what they feared. For a city used to hosting international students, this was no longer a story of cultural exchange or youthful adventure. It had become a story of death, suspicion, and betrayal. Inside the house, investigators worked methodically. The smell of bleach and blood hung in the air, the sterile tools of forensic science clashing against the brutality of the crime. Each object, each stain, each footprint was photographed, catalogued, stored. Yet behind the scientific process lay a tension, a sense of urgency. For this was no ordinary murder. It had already captured international headlines. Meredith's death was not only a private tragedy, but a public spectacle, and every decision, every piece of evidence, would soon be scrutinized by the world. Amanda Knox, pale and visibly shaken, was led into the station for questioning. She was 20 years old, wide-eyed from Seattle, studying languages in Perugia. To her, Italy had been a dream of art, food, romance. Now, she was at the center of a nightmare. She told police she had spent the night with her boyfriend, Raffaele Solicito, a young Italian computer science student. They had cooked dinner, smoked marijuana, watched a film, and fallen asleep together. It was a simple alibi, she thought, one that would clear her from suspicion. But police were already noticing details that unsettled them. Her demeanor shifted. At times, she was cooperative, even cheerful. At others, distracted, unfocused, inconsistent. Some officers described her as too calm, others as strangely detached, as if she didn't grasp the gravity of what had happened. The media seized on these contradictions immediately. Italian newspapers splashed her photograph across front pages. The foreign student, the American, the flatmate of the victim. It was irresistible. Overnight, Amanda Knox became the mysterious figure at the heart of the crime. Was she a witness, a suspect, or something more complicated? Meanwhile, Raffaele Solicito was questioned as well. He came from a respected family, his father a doctor, his life stable and academic. Yet when pressed on details of the night, his story wavered. Times changed, events blurred. Had he really been with Amanda all night? Could he be sure? Investigators pressed harder, their suspicion mounting. And then there was another name, Rudy Herman Guade. A 20-year-old man from the Ivory Coast, living in Perugia, known to police for minor infractions. He floated at the edges of student life, sometimes welcomed into parties, sometimes drifting alone. He was remembered by some as friendly, by others as unsettling. His fingerprints, his DNA, were found in Meredith's room, on her belongings, even inside her body. To investigators, this was the breakthrough. Here was someone who had undeniably been present at the scene of the crime. But if Guade had been there, had he acted alone? Or had others been with him? Theories began to multiply, each one darker than the last. Perhaps it had been a burglary gone wrong, investigators first suggested. But the strange staging of the window break-in cast doubt on that. Perhaps it had been a sexual assault. Meredith's injuries, her state of undress, pointed in that direction. Perhaps it had been more, a group attack, fueled by drugs, jealousy, or a twisted thrill. Amanda Knox and Rafael Solecito remained under intense scrutiny. Witnesses claimed they had seen them near the house on the night of the murder. Phone records showed unusual gaps. Knox's own account shifted under pressure. Small changes, but enough to alarm investigators. At one point, she even suggested she had been at the house, hearing Meredith's screams, but later retracted the statement, blaming exhaustion and coercion. To police, this was not simply confusion. It was a sign of guilt. Public opinion hardened quickly. Knox, with her youthful looks and foreign accent, was transformed in the media into a symbol. The angel-faced killer, they called her. Tabloids painted her as a femme fatale, a manipulator, an American student who had brought chaos into a quiet Italian town. Solicito, too, was portrayed as a willing accomplice, drawn into her orbit. The narrative was irresistible, dramatic, tragic, and in the center, forgotten at times, was Meredith herself, whose life had ended with violence and whose family was now forced to grieve under the glare of relentless headlines. Her parents and siblings arrived in Perugia to identify her, to collect what was left of her belongings, to sit through press conferences where their daughter's name was repeated alongside words like orgy, knife, murder. The cruelty of it compounded their grief. They spoke softly, with dignity, about Meredith's life, how she had loved reading, dancing, traveling, how she had been so full of light. And now she was gone, reduced to evidence bags and autopsy reports. The trial by media had begun long before the trial by law. Journalists dissected every gesture, every smile, every tear. When Knox kissed Solicito outside the house, cameras captured it. To some, it was a sign of callousness. To others, simply a desperate attempt at comfort in a moment of horror. But in a case where perception mattered as much as proof, those images shaped opinion. As days turned into weeks, police reconstructed the timeline again and again. They examined calls, texts, movements. Knox had received a text from her boss at a bar where she worked, telling her she wasn't needed that night. She claimed she had gone to Solicito's instead. But the investigators found her phone records peculiar. Solicito's as well. The inconsistencies grew heavier, more damning in the eyes of the prosecution. And then, the knife. In Solicito's apartment, investigators seized a kitchen knife. Tests revealed Meredith's DNA on the blade and Knox's on the handle. It was the smoking gun, they believed, the weapon of murder. Yet the sample was tiny, contested, later challenged by experts. But in those early days, it was enough to solidify suspicion. The trio, Knox, Solicito, and Guede were now the central figures of the case, their names linked in a deadly triangle of accusation. Rudy Guede fled Italy after the murder, eventually arrested in Germany. He admitted being at the house, admitted being with Meredith, but denied killing her. He claimed he had gone to the bathroom when an unknown man entered and attacked her. His story shifted, implausible, but his presence at the scene was undeniable. For investigators, this was both clarity and confusion. Guede was guilty, surely, but was he guilty alone? The possibility of a group crime haunted the narrative. The brutality of the attack suggested more than one assailant, prosecutors argued. The staging of the burglary, the conflicting alibis, the strange behavior, all pointed, they said, to a conspiracy. It was not enough for Meredith to have been killed. She must have been killed by a group, and Knox and Solicito must have been part of it. As winter settled over Perugia, the city transformed. The Christmas lights went up, students returned home for the holidays, but the shadow of the murder lingered. For the Kircher family, it was their first Christmas without Meredith. Their grief deepened by the spectacle of the trial to come. For Amanda Knox and Raffaele Solecito, it was the beginning of a long descent into prison cells, courtrooms, appeals. For Rudy Guede, it was the confrontation of his own guilt. But on those first weeks after the murder, before the legal battle stretched on for years, the atmosphere was one of confusion, shock, and fear. The truth lay tangled in contradictory statements, in DNA traces so small they barely existed, in the interpretations of gestures and silences. The house on Via della Pergola, once filled with the laughter of students, now stood empty, its windows shuttered, its rooms haunted. The blood had been scrubbed away, but the stain remained in the air, in the memory of every person who had stepped inside. Meredith Kircher's murder had already become more than a crime. It was a story of culture clash, of media obsession, of justice both sought and denied. And as the investigation deepened, as the suspects shifted from frightened students to accused killers, the world leaned closer, watching, judging, waiting for answers that seemed always just out of reach. The police headquarters in Perugia became a theater of tension, a place where young lives were broken down into interrogations, timelines, contradictions. Amanda Knox sat in the stark light of the questioning room, her hands folded, her voice wavering as detectives pressed her again and again about the night Meredith was killed. Hours blurred into one another, the same questions asked in different tones, gentle persuasion giving way to sharp accusation. At times she cried, at times she laughed nervously, and at times she said nothing at all. Each gesture, each silence, was written into reports as if they were evidence themselves. What unsettled the investigators most was not only what she said, but what she failed to say. They wanted clarity, a consistent story, but instead they heard fragments. At one point, Amanda spoke of being in the house, hearing Meredith's screams. Later she retracted it, saying she had been confused, pressured, exhausted. To the police, this was more than confusion. It was a crack in the surface, a glimpse of something darker. Raffaele Solecito was subjected to the same relentless questioning. The young man who had lived quietly, devoted to computers and his studies, now found himself cornered. At first, he defended Amanda, swore that they had been together all night, but under the weight of interrogation, his resolve faltered. He admitted small inconsistencies, opened the door to doubt. "Perhaps," he said at one point. She left for a short while. The words landed like a thunderclap. If Amanda had left, where had she gone? And what had she done? The prosecutors seized on these cracks. The picture they began to paint was one of complicity, of young lovers bound together by secrecy, joined that night by another. Rudy Guede, whose DNA tied him irrevocably to the crime scene. The theory grew in their minds like wildfire. 3 young people, intoxicated, driven by jealousy, by lust, by something primal, had turned the quiet house into a chamber of horror. It was speculation, but it was speculation with a narrative that the press devoured. Outside the police station, cameras waited. Each time Amanda was led in or out, flashes exploded, capturing her expressions, her clothes, her every movement. When she smiled at a reporter or adjusted her hair, tabloids turned it into proof of her coldness. When she leaned against Solicito, it was read as arrogance. The media built a persona, Foxy Noxy, the American student with an angelic face and a devilish heart. It was a nickname from her teenage soccer days, harmless then, but in the crucible of Perugia it became a weapon. The Kircher family watched in anguish as Meredith's story was drowned out. Their daughter was gone, and yet the world seemed more interested in Amanda's looks, her love life, her personality. They wanted justice, clarity, but instead they saw a circus forming around their tragedy. Still, they stood with quiet dignity, repeating what mattered. Meredith was the victim. Meredith had been murdered, and Meredith deserved the truth. In November, Amanda and Raphael were formally arrested. They were led into custody, their faces pale, their futures uncertain. The charges: murder and sexual assault. The evidence: a mixture of DNA traces, inconsistent stories, and the interpretation of behavior. Rudy Guade, too, was arrested after being tracked to Germany. Unlike the others, his presence at the scene was undeniable. He admitted it himself, but his version of events was slippery. He claimed he and Meredith had been intimate, consensually, that night. He claimed he had gone to the bathroom when an unknown man entered and attacked her. He said he heard Meredith scream, returned to find her bleeding, and fled in panic. His story was riddled with holes, but it left open the possibility of accomplices. The trial of Rudy Guade came first. In a fast-track procedure, he was convicted of sexual assault and murder, sentenced to 30 years in prison. The conviction established one truth: Meredith had not died alone, and Guade had been there. But for prosecutors, that was not enough. They argued he had not acted alone, that Amanda and Raphael were part of the attack, and so the stage was set for a trial that would capture the world. The courtroom in Perugia was old, its walls lined with history, but when the trial began in 2009, it felt more like a stage for theater than a chamber of justice. Journalists filled the benches, cameras waited outside. Prosecutors spoke of satanic rituals, of twisted sexuality, of a murder driven by lust and jealousy. They described Amanda Knox as manipulative, as the orchestrator of the night's violence. Raphael, they said, was her willing accomplice. Guade was painted as the third hand in a deadly triangle. The defense countered with equal passion. They argued the evidence was flawed, contaminated. They pointed out that much of the DNA was too small to be reliable. The knife, they said, had never been proven to be the weapon. The footprint evidence was inconclusive. They argued Amanda's odd behavior was the result of youth, shock, cultural misunderstanding, not guilt. They reminded the court that Guade's DNA was the only clear evidence in the room where Meredith was killed. Why, then, drag 2 other young lives into ruin? But the court was not only about science, it was about perception. Witnesses testified about Amanda's behavior, how she performed cartwheels at the police station, how she seemed unconcerned, how she was seen kissing outside the house. Each anecdote painted a picture. Each gesture became part of the case. In the eyes of many, she was already guilty. The Kircher family sat through it all, forced to relive the details of Meredith's death. The wounds, the blood, the final moments of her life were described again and again. For them, the trial was not only about guilt or innocence, but about keeping Meredith from being forgotten amid the chaos. They listened with quiet pain, their grief exposed to the public. their daughter's memory twisted by competing narratives. As the trial dragged on, it became an international obsession. In America, Amanda was portrayed as a victim of a foreign justice system, a young woman trapped in a nightmare. In Italy, she was often portrayed as cunning, dangerous, a femme fatale. The divide was cultural, political, emotional. It turned a tragedy into a battleground of perceptions, and still, at the center of it all, was Meredith. Her face, her smile, her future that would never be. The brutality of her death was sometimes lost in the noise, but it remained the anchor of the story. She had been attacked, terrified, killed in her own home. No matter the debates, no matter the headlines, that was the truth that could not be erased. In December 2009, after months of trial, the verdict came. Amanda Knox and Raffaele Solecito were found guilty of murder and sexual assault. Knox was sentenced to 26 years, Solecito to 25. The courtroom erupted in shock, in tears, in applause. For some, justice had been served. For others, it was a miscarriage of justice, a conviction built on shaky evidence and prejudice. Amanda collapsed, sobbing. Raphael stared ahead, stunned. Their families wept, devastated. The Kirchers held on to one thought. Meredith's killer, or killers, had been punished. But even then, questions lingered, doubts festered. Outside the courthouse, reporters broadcast live, their words carried across oceans. The case of Meredith Kircher was no longer just a trial. It had become a story that belonged to the world. But the story was far from over. Appeals would follow, new evidence would be uncovered, verdicts overturned, reputations destroyed and rebuilt. The search for the truth, or for what each side called truth, was only beginning. And in the shadows of Perugia, the house at Via della Pergola remained empty, silent, its windows shuttered, a monument not to justice, but to the violence that had taken place inside. Winter in Perugia settled heavy and cold, but the air around the courthouse still vibrated with the echoes of the verdict. Amanda Knox and Raffaele Solecito, two students who had come to this city for love, for learning, for discovery, were now locked in prison cells with decades stretching before them. The world outside was divided, some convinced of their guilt, others certain of their innocence. But inside those stone walls, time slowed to a crawl. Every sound became sharper, every hour longer, every memory heavier. Amanda's parents flew back and forth across the Atlantic, their lives consumed by the desperate attempt to free their daughter. In Italy, her face had become a symbol of cunning and deceit, the foreign girl who had lured friends into a nightmare. In America, she was painted as the innocent abroad, a victim of a medieval justice system, a pawn in a sensationalist game. The same photographs were used to tell two opposing stories, and in the war of narratives, the truth seemed always just out of reach. Raphael's family fought just as fiercely. His father spoke of his son's gentleness, his dedication to study, his inability to harm. Yet the shadow of Meredith's murder hung over every word, every plea. Convicted murderers were not seen as sons or daughters, but as criminals, reduced to their labels, stripped of their humanity. And so both families waged a battle not only against the verdict, but against perception itself. Meanwhile, Meredith's family carried a grief far quieter, far heavier. Their daughter was gone, her laughter silenced, her place at the table forever empty. And as appeals loomed, they were asked again to sit in courtrooms, to listen to arguments about DNA, knives, alibis, theories, all while the image of Meredith's final moments replayed in their minds. They were forced to become witnesses in a performance they never wished to see, their pain exposed to strangers, their dignity tested again and again. The appeals began in 2010. Amanda and Raffaele's lawyers attacked the heart of the prosecution's case, the DNA evidence. They argued that the traces on the knife were too small, too degraded, contaminated by mishandling. They argued that the bloody footprint, attributed to Sollecito, was in fact Meredith's own. They challenged witnesses who had shifted their stories. They dismantled timelines built on speculation. What had once seemed like damning proof now appeared fragile, uncertain. Experts were brought in, their testimony cutting through the dramatic narratives with cold science. Independent forensic specialists declared that the DNA results were unreliable, that the methods used by police were flawed. The courtroom, once filled with talk of orgies and satanic rituals, was now filled with charts, slides, microscopes, and slowly, piece by piece, the prosecution's case began to erode. Outside the courthouse, the crowds grew restless. Supporters of Knox held vigils, holding signs that read, "Free Amanda." Critics shouted back, demanding justice for Meredith. The media fed on the tension, every headline written to shock, every broadcast designed to stir. It was no longer about evidence alone. It was about the image of guilt and innocence, about whose version of the story the world would believe. Amanda herself took the stand during the appeal. She spoke in Italian, her voice trembling, her words deliberate. She declared her innocence, described the loneliness of prison, the nightmare of being cast as a monster. She spoke of Meredith, of the friendship they had, of the horror of losing her. The courtroom listened in silence. Some moved, others unmoved. But in that moment, Amanda was no longer just Foxy Knoxy from the headlines. She was a young woman, trembling before judgment. Raphael, too, spoke, his voice steadier, his demeanor calm. He spoke of confusion, of being trapped in a storm not of his making, of the pain of watching his life collapse. He maintained his innocence as he always had, his eyes fixed on the judges who would decide his fate. And then came the turning point. In October 2011, the appeals court delivered its verdict. The convictions were overturned. Amanda Knox and Raffaele Sollecito were acquitted, released after 4 long years behind bars. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Cheers, tears, shouts of anger, cries of relief. Amanda collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably. Outside, her family embraced her as if pulling her back into life itself. For them, it was a resurrection. For others, it was a betrayal of justice. The Kircher family stood stunned, devastated. They spoke with dignity, but their pain was unmistakable. They had believed justice had been served, and now it seemed torn away. Meredith was still gone, her killer, or killers, still contested, her memory still entangled in uncertainty. For them, there was no closure, only an endless reopening of wounds. Amanda flew home to Seattle the next day. At the airport, cameras followed her every step, microphones pushed toward her face. Crowds cheered as if she were a hero returning from battle. She wept as she hugged her mother, her father, tasting freedom again, breathing air without walls. But even then, she knew freedom did not mean peace. Her name would forever be linked to Meredith's death, her life forever shadowed by suspicion. Raphael returned to his own quiet life in Italy, but he too could not escape the label. Friends avoided him, strangers stared, the press circled. Acquitted in law, he remained condemned in rumor, his innocence doubted by many. His life, once simple, had been permanently altered, but the story did not end there. The Italian justice system allowed for further appeals, and prosecutors, convinced of Amanda and Raffaele's guilt, pursued the case again. In 2013, Italy's highest court annulled the acquittal, ordering a retrial. The nightmare returned, dragging Amanda back into the spotlight, forcing Raphael once again into the grip of suspicion. In 2014, the retrial delivered a shocking twist. Both Amanda and Raphael, were convicted once more. Amanda, now back in the United States, faced the possibility of extradition. Raphael, still in Italy, felt the weight of prison closing in again. The yo-yo of justice left both families, both nations, in turmoil. Was this incompetence, corruption, or the search for truth? Nobody could answer with certainty. And then, in 2015, the final act. Italy's Supreme Court overturned the convictions once and for all, declaring the case closed against Amanda Knox and Raffaele Sollecito. They were free, permanently this time, their legal battles finally over. But freedom came at a price. Years stolen, reputations shattered, lives defined by a murder they insisted they had no part in. Through it all, one name remained the most important, yet the most overshadowed: Meredith Kercher. Her memory, her life, often faded behind the frenzy of Amanda Knox's story. But to those who knew her, Meredith was not just the victim of a crime, not just a symbol in a courtroom drama. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a young woman who had come to Italy for joy and discovery, and instead found terror in the very place she should have felt safe. And so, even as courts shifted, as verdicts rose and fell like waves, one truth never changed: Meredith Kercher was gone. And the shadow of her absence stretched far beyond Perugia, far beyond Italy, across oceans and into the hearts of everyone who had followed her story. The streets of Perugia eventually returned to their rhythms, but the case never left the world's gaze. The house on Via della Pergola stood shuttered, an unspoken monument to violence, yet outside Italy the story only grew louder. Newspapers on every continent ran front-page headlines about Amanda Knox, Raffaele Sollecito, Rudy Guede, and the brutal murder of Meredith Kercher. What should have been a tragedy, centered on a young woman's death, transformed into an international war of narratives. In the United States, Amanda was presented as a daughter trapped in the gears of a flawed system, a symbol of injustice abroad. Talk shows debated her innocence. Documentaries dissected the trial. Journalists flew across the Atlantic to capture images of her parents holding vigils. In Italy, the tone was far different. There, Amanda was portrayed as manipulative, a woman who had hidden her cruelty behind a mask of youth and beauty. The Italian press used photographs of her smiling in court as proof of her arrogance, of her guilt. The contrast between these portrayals was staggering, a cultural chasm that turned the case into a diplomatic flashpoint. Television anchors spoke not only of murder, but of national pride, of foreign interference, of justice questioned by outsiders. The Kercher family, caught between these storms, pleaded simply for their daughter's memory not to be lost in translation. They asked again and again that the focus return to Meredith, who she had been, how she had lived, how she had been taken from them. But in the clamor of headlines, their voices were often drowned out. Meredith's story had begun as one of promise. A young woman from South London, intelligent, full of life, exploring a foreign culture with excitement and curiosity. She loved music, loved to laugh, had a circle of friends who described her as warm, generous, thoughtful. That was the Meredith her family knew, the Meredith they grieved. But to the wider world, she became a symbol of victimhood, the silent figure at the heart of a drama she could no longer speak for. The house itself remained a character in the story, silent yet full of echoes. Journalists described its every detail: the broken window, the bloodstains, the narrow hallway leading to Meredith's room. Photographs of its stone walls appeared in papers around the globe, as if the building itself held the answers. Tourists in Perugia asked locals to point it out, their curiosity mingling with unease. What had once been a student's residence was now infamous, frozen in time as the setting of a crime that had captured the world's imagination. Inside prison walls, Amanda Knox kept diaries. She wrote of confusion, of fear, of her longing for freedom. She wrote about being cast as a monster, about the surreal experience of watching herself dissected in newspapers as if she were a character in a novel. Raphael did the same, describing the suffocating weight of suspicion, the bitterness of being tied to a crime he swore he had not committed. Their words would later be published, pored over by journalists and readers, each sentence read as evidence of guilt or innocence. Rudy Guade, serving his sentence, remained the constant in a case defined by uncertainty. His DNA was undeniable, his presence proven. And yet his version of events shifted like sand, sometimes suggesting accomplices, sometimes insisting he had been a bystander. He became both a central figure and a ghost at the edge of the story, his guilt confirmed, but his role in the larger narrative forever contested. The years dragged on. Appeals, retrials, reversals. Each development reignited the media storm, each verdict dissected across talk shows, news programs, documentaries. The world argued, but the truth seemed to retreat further into shadow. For every claim of innocence, there was a counterclaim of guilt. For every forensic explanation, there was a doubt cast by another expert. Justice, in this case, became not a conclusion, but an ongoing battle. For the Kirchers, the ordeal was relentless. They traveled to Italy for hearings, sat in courtrooms while lawyers argued about DNA and knives, forced to hear the intimate details of their daughter's final moments again and again. They endured questions from journalists who seemed more interested in Amanda's tears than in Meredith's life. Yet they never faltered in their dignity, reminding the world that Meredith was more than a victim, more than a headline. And through it all, Perugia changed. The city, once known for chocolate festivals and medieval charm, became synonymous with murder. Students who arrived in later years were warned about the case, reminded of the danger that had once struck in their midst. The shadow of Meredith's death stretched far beyond the walls of that house, far beyond Italy itself. In Seattle, Amanda Knox became both free and imprisoned at once. Even after her final acquittal, she could not step into the world without being recognized. Strangers stared, some offering sympathy, others condemnation. Employers hesitated, neighbors whispered. Her name, forever linked with murder, was no longer her own. It belonged to the world's perception, to the story that had been told and retold until it hardened into myth. Raphael, too, carried the scars. He published books, gave interviews, but could never escape the shadow. His life, once defined by studies and quiet ambition, had been consumed by the whirlwind of suspicion. He would forever be remembered not as himself, but as Amanda's boyfriend, the accused, and Meredith. She remained forever 21, frozen in photographs, in memories, in the voices of those who loved her. Her absence became her presence, a constant reminder that beneath the spectacle lay a human life cut short. Her story was not one of trials and appeals, but of a young woman who should have lived, who should have laughed again, who should have gone home to her family with stories of Italy's beauty, not with her life stolen in the dark. The media frenzy, the cultural clash, the endless courtroom battles, they all blurred the edges of truth. What remained sharp, unchanging, was the violence of that night, the horror of her final moments, the silence that followed. The world debated innocence and guilt, but for Meredith, the ending was always the same. And in that truth lies the haunting heart of the case. Not just a question of who or how or why, but the undeniable fact of loss. A family torn apart, a city stained, a generation of students forever remembering the night when Perugia's quiet streets echoed with screams that no one heard in time. The years passed, but the story of Meredith Kircher's murder refused to fade. It lingered in headlines, in television specials, in whispered debates across dinner tables. It was not only a crime. It had become a mirror reflecting fear, prejudice, obsession, and the fragility of truth itself. Every retelling reshaped the narrative. Every opinion hardened into conviction. Every silence carried an accusation. The world had not simply witnessed a trial. It had witnessed the creation of a myth that devoured lives. For Amanda Knox, the return to America was no homecoming of peace. She stepped off the plane into the blinding light of cameras, her tears captured from every angle. To some, she was a survivor, a young woman who had endured years of injustice. To others, she was a killer who had escaped punishment. Strangers wrote letters filled with sympathy. Strangers wrote letters filled with hate. Her face appeared on magazine covers, her name spoken by politicians, her story dissected in documentaries. Freedom meant walking through a world that no longer belonged to her. In interviews, her voice trembled with the effort to explain what could not truly be explained. She described the weight of being miscast, the terror of prison nights when she felt the world's hatred pressing against the bars. She spoke of Meredith, always Meredith, and the guilt of surviving while her friend had not. But no explanation could erase the suspicions etched into the public imagination. She was both victim and villain, depending on who you asked, depending on which headline you read. Raffaele Sollecito, quitter, less scrutinized abroad, but still infamous in Italy, carried his own burden. His life had been rewritten against his will. Once a student of computers and medicine, he became a symbol of loyalty, of alleged complicity, of shattered innocence. He too wrote books, gave speeches, tried to reclaim his narrative. Yet each step forward was met with the echo of the past. The question followed him like a shadow. What really happened that night? Meanwhile, Rudy Guede served his sentence in Italy. Over time, his punishment was reduced through appeals and good behavior. He admitted his presence, admitted his mistakes, but never accepted full responsibility for the murder. His words left space for mystery, for speculation. He emerged eventually on day release, walking free while the world still debated whether he had acted alone or alongside others. To many, his release felt like another fracture in a case already scarred by doubt. But beyond the accused, beyond the courtroom, lay the deepest wound, the Kircher family's loss. They returned to London carrying absence as if it were an object, a weight they could never set down. Meredith's room remained a shrine of photographs, her laughter now only a memory echoing in old recordings, her future a series of questions that would never be answered. Each new trial forced them to return to the moment of her death, to hear lawyers speak of her as evidence, to hear strangers speculate about her private life. Their grief was exposed to the world, their mourning public, their daughter's name forever tied to brutality, and still the fascination continued. Television producers scripted dramas, journalists returned to Perugia to film documentaries, authors wrote books that promised the truth but delivered interpretations. The case became not just about Meredith, but about us, about why we are drawn to stories of beauty and violence, about why we cannot look away when innocence collides with horror. Perugia itself carried the stain. Students continued to come, drawn by language and history, but the shadow lingered. Taxi drivers spoke of the case. Guides pointed discreetly to the house. Locals remembered the frenzy of reporters who had once clogged their narrow streets. The city was no longer only medieval charm and university life. It was the place where Meredith Kircher was murdered, where the world descended to watch, even years later. Amanda Knox could not walk into a cafe without feeling eyes upon her. Every relationship was colored by the past, every achievement shadowed. She described waking in the night with prison sounds still ringing in her ears, The clanging of doors, the shuffle of guards, the whispers of other inmates. Raphael, too, spoke of nightmares, of flashbacks, of the moment when his name first appeared beside the word murderer. These were scars invisible but deep, wounds that no court ruling could erase. The media's hunger for spectacle had created villains and victims, but what it never delivered was certainty. And perhaps that was the cruelest part. For despite years of investigation, despite trials and retrials, despite forensic reports and judicial rulings, the question that haunted Perugia never fully faded. What exactly happened in Meredith Kircher's room that night? Some believed the answer was simple. Rudy Guedi alone, a burglary that turned violent, a young woman overpowered. Others insisted it was more a conspiracy, a twisted act involving three. Still others saw the entire investigation as flawed, a tragedy compounded by injustice. Each version carried its own logic, its own evidence, its own loyal believers. And so the story became fractured, a puzzle missing pieces that may never be found. For the Kircher family, this uncertainty was the most unbearable of all. They wanted justice, but more than that, they wanted truth. They wanted to know, with clarity, what their daughter had faced in her final moments. They wanted to close their eyes at night without replaying endless versions of her death. But the world offered no certainty, only speculation dressed as answers. And that is why, long after the courts fell silent, the story remained alive. Because it was never only about crime and punishment. It was about the fragility of truth, about the way stories shape our understanding of innocence and guilt, about the thin line between perception and reality. It was about how a single night could unravel lives across continents, leaving scars on families, on cities, on the world's collective memory. Meredith Kircher's murder was not just a crime that happened in Italy in 2007. It became a story that revealed how quickly justice can become theater, how easily grief can be consumed by spectacle, how fragile reputations are when held up to the light of suspicion. It became a reminder that behind every headline is a human life, full of dreams, laughter, love, that can be extinguished in an instant, leaving only silence where once there was song. And in that silence, in the unanswered questions, lies the haunting truth. The story of Meredith Kircher will never truly end. Time has a way of softening headlines, of replacing noise with silence, of allowing even the loudest scandals to slip into memory. Yet some stories refuse to die. The murder of Meredith Kircher is one of them. Long after verdicts were read, long after the cameras turned away, the shadow of that November night in Perugia still lingers, in the quiet grief of a family, in the haunted steps of those accused, in the collective imagination of millions who followed the case across oceans. Amanda Knox tried to rebuild a life from the ashes of her name. She wrote books, gave speeches, stood on stages to tell her version of the truth. She described the terror of being cast as a villain, of being trapped in a nightmare where the world decided who she was before she could speak. But even as she tried to reclaim her story, she could never step fully out of Meredith's shadow. Every question, every interview returned to that night, that house, that scream in the dark. Freedom did not mean escape. It meant carrying a ghost forever. Rafael Solecito, too, tried to step into a life beyond the case. He studied, he worked, he spoke of innocence. Yet for him, the label of the boyfriend remained, a chain invisible but unbreakable. Wherever he went, the past followed. Strangers whispered, colleagues hesitated, friends disappeared. He had been acquitted, yes, but absolution was something the world could not give him. His life was divided into two halves, before Meredith Kircher's death and after. And Rudy Guade, the man whose DNA bound him irrevocably to the scene, walked out of prison early, his sentence reduced, his debt to the law declared paid. But outside, society's judgment remained. He spoke of rehabilitation, of moving forward. Yet for many, his release was another wound, another reminder of justice unfinished. He was free, but Meredith was still gone, and that truth could never be reconciled. For the Kirches, the world had changed in an instant, and it would never change back. They lived with a void where Meredith had been, her voice now only in recordings, her smile only in photographs. They endured the circus of trials, the endless debates about guilt and innocence, the way strangers spoke of their daughter as though she were a puzzle piece instead of a person. Yet they carried themselves with quiet strength, reminding everyone who listened that Meredith was more than a victim. She was a young woman full of life, who had loved, who had dreamed, who should have lived. But perhaps the greatest tragedy was not only Meredith's death, it was how her story was consumed. It became a spectacle, a battle between nations, a theater of guilt and innocence, while the simplest, most painful truth was overshadowed. A daughter had been taken from her family, a life stolen in the silence of her own room. That truth should have united people in grief, yet instead it divided them in suspicion. Perugia remains, its walls ancient, its streets filled with students, its cafes buzzing with life. But for those who remember, the city will always be the stage of a crime that drew the eyes of the world. Tourists still ask to see the house on Via della Pergola, still whisper as they walk past, as though the walls themselves might confess what happened. Yet the house says nothing. It stands in silence, a monument to secrets. And what of justice? Some say it was served when Guade was convicted. Others say it was never served, that the truth was buried under flawed investigations and media frenzy. The law closed its books, but the world has not. The case lives on in debates, in documentaries, in the uneasy sense that the full story remains hidden just beyond reach. Meredith Kirch's story endures because it embodies more than crime. It embodies the fragility of innocence, the danger of perception, the hunger of the media, the pain of a family left behind. It forces us to ask unsettling questions. How quickly can a life unravel under suspicion? How fragile is truth when filtered through headlines? How can justice exist when certainty is lost? And so the legacy of this case is not only in the courtroom, not only in the names of Amanda, Raffaele, or Rudy. It is in the lesson that behind every headline lies a human life, a daughter, a sister, a friend, whose story deserves to be remembered not for the manner of her death, but for the fullness of her life. Meredith loved music, loved to laugh, loved to explore. She was 21, with a future stretching wide before her. That is what should be remembered. That is what was stolen. In the end, the story of Meredith Kircher remains suspended in the air, unfinished, unresolved in the hearts of those who followed it. It is a story of violence and suspicion, of grief and spectacle, of innocence and guilt blurred until they became almost indistinguishable. It is a reminder that the truth can be buried, that justice can fracture, that lives can be consumed by narratives not of their own making. And perhaps that is why the story endures, because it is not just about what happened on November 1st, 2007, in a quiet student house in Perugia. It is about how quickly darkness can fall, how deeply it can scar, how impossible it is to ever fully understand the last moments of a life stolen in silence. Meredith Kircher's name will always carry sorrow, but it should also carry light. The light of the person she was, the light her family remembers, the light that cannot be extinguished even by the darkest of nights.